The battlefield of despair. The stench of scorched metal and burnt flesh filled the air, mingling with the acrid tang of plasma residue. Sergeant Ethan Cross, Earth Marine Corps, tightened his grip on his plasma rifle as he moved cautiously through the desolate battlefield. The ground beneath his boots crunched with debris, shattered armor plating, discarded weapon fragments, and the remains of fallen comrades. This was no victory, it was a massacre. His unit, the 42nd Marine Recon Division, had been annihilated in a brutal assault by the insectoid Vrelka. Ethan was one of the few survivors, though survivor felt like a hollow term. His comms were dead, his squad was gone, and his energy reserves were running dangerously low. The forward command post, once a bustling hub of strategic activity, was now a smoldering ruin. Ethan paused near a collapsed barricade, scanning the horizon for movement. His visor flickered with static, the built-in sensors struggling to adapt to the electromagnetic interference from the enemy's weapons. Just as he adjusted his stance, a faint sound caught his attention, something between a groan and a hum. It wasn't human. Lowering himself into a crouch, he followed the sound, moving with the deliberate precision of a trained soldier. His pulse quickened when he spotted the source, a figure trapped beneath the wreckage of what looked like a downed alien transport. The creature's armor shimmered faintly, reflecting hues of violet and silver, and its exposed skin bore a pale blue tint. Ethan recognized the species immediately, a Darien warrior. The Darians were one of humanity's fiercest allies in the war against the Vrelka, known for their unmatched strength and advanced technology. Yet, as Ethan approached, he realized this one wasn't fighting anymore. The Darien, a female judging by the subtle differences in physique, lay motionless, her legs pinned beneath twisted metal. Her breathing was labored, and her eyes, bright silver with flecks of gold, fluttered open as Ethan knelt beside her. Human, her voice was soft but tinged with urgency. "Leave me." Ethan ignored her, pulling out his field scanner. The readings confirmed his fears. Her spinal column had sustained critical damage, rendering her legs useless. Protocol was clear, immobile casualties were to be left behind in hostile zones. But as Ethan looked into her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to follow that cold directive. "Not happening," he muttered, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "You're not dying here." "You don't understand," she rasped, her voice carrying a melodic accent. "My injuries, they will slow you down. The enemy is coming. You must." "Shut it," Ethan interrupted, already working to free her from the wreckage. "I didn't make it through all this hell just to leave you behind." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Stubborn human. You'll learn to love it," he shot back, gritting his teeth as he used every ounce of his augmented strength to lift the debris. The Darien cried out in pain as he shifted the metal, but she didn't protest further. Her armor, despite its elegant design, had taken significant damage, exposing parts of her torso and legs to the harsh environment. "What's your name?" Ethan asked as he finally freed her. "Lyrian," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Captain of the 3rd Darien Vanguard." "Well, Captain Lyrian, you're officially my VIP now," Ethan said, lifting her carefully. "Hold on tight." Her head rested against his shoulder as he carried her through the wreckage, every step calculated to avoid detection. The weight of her body was negligible, thanks to his enhanced combat suit, but the tension in the air was suffocating. His visor detected faint heat signatures in the distance, enemy patrols. "Why are you doing this?" Lyrian asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Because I can," Ethan replied simply. "And because it's the right thing to do." Silence fell between them as they moved through the ruins. Lyrian's breathing grew steadier, though Ethan could feel her body trembling against his. The faint hum of Vrelka drones grew louder, forcing him to take a detour through a collapsed building. His enhanced senses kept him on high alert, every shadow a potential threat. Finally, they reached a relatively secure location, a partially intact maintenance bay. Ethan set Lyrian down gently, his eyes scanning the room for supplies. The bay's automated systems were offline, but there was enough scrap to fashion temporary defenses. "We'll rest here," he said, kneeling beside her. "I'll patch you up as best as I can." Lyrian studied him, her gaze piercing despite her weakened state. "You're risking your life for an enemy target." "Enemy?" Ethan smirked. "Last I checked, we're on the same side." "I'm a liability," she insisted. "Your survival should come first." "Not my style," he replied, pulling out his medkit. "Now, hold still." As he worked, a faint blush spread across Lyrian's cheeks. "Your compassion, it's unusual." Ethan chuckled. "Guess you don't know many humans." "I know enough to recognize exceptional ones," she murmured, her voice softening. Ethan paused, meeting her gaze. For a moment, the chaos of the battlefield faded, replaced by a quiet understanding between two warriors. Then, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. "They've found us," Lyrian whispered, her tone urgent. Ethan grabbed his rifle, his body tensing as the first Vrelka drone appeared in the doorway. He glanced at Lyrian, who managed a weak nod. "Stay low," he ordered. "This is going to get messy." As the drone advanced, Ethan fired the first shot, his plasma rifle lighting up the room. The battle for survival had only just begun. "The enemy closes in." Ethan's plasma rifle lit up the darkened maintenance bay as the first Vrelka drone disintegrated under his precise shot. The high-pitched whine of its systems dying echoed through the space, followed quickly by the heavy clatter of its collapsing frame. But the victory was short-lived. Through his visor, Ethan detected more heat signatures approaching, at least 5 more drones. "Looks like they're throwing a welcoming party," he muttered, quickly scanning the room for anything he could use to reinforce their position. Lyrian, still propped against the wall, watched him with sharp, calculating eyes. Despite her injuries, her warrior instincts hadn't dulled. "Vrelka drones always scout in packs," she said. "They'll try to flush you out, then overwhelm you with numbers." "Good to know," Ethan replied, already moving to block the entrance with a pile of scrap metal. His hands worked quickly, forming a makeshift barricade. "Guess I'll have to disappoint them." Lyrian's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, but her expression remained tense. "You should leave me. Use the distraction to escape." Ethan paused, his gaze snapping to hers. "You really don't get how this works, do you? I'm not leaving you." Her silver eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. "Stubborn human," she whispered again, almost fondly. "Damn right," Ethan said, turning his attention back to the doorway. He adjusted his rifle settings, switching to a spread-shot mode better suited for close combat. The Vrelka drones were drawing closer now, their faint, chittering sound sending a shiver down his spine. He took a steadying breath, readying himself for the onslaught. The first 2 drones burst into the room almost simultaneously, their sleek, insect-like forms glinting in the dim light. Ethan dropped to one knee, firing a burst of plasma that tore through the closest drone's central core. The second drone pivoted toward him, its mandibles clicking as it charged its energy weapon. "Left flank." Lyrian called out, her sharp eyes catching the movement before Ethan did. He spun just in time to see another drone skittering along the wall. Without hesitation, he fired, the plasma bolt striking true and sending the drone crashing to the ground in a smoldering heap. "Nice catch," Ethan said, glancing over his shoulder at Lyrian. "Don't thank me yet," she replied, her voice tight. "There are more coming." As if on cue, 3 more drones appeared, their movements unnervingly coordinated. Ethan gritted his teeth, his combat instincts kicking into overdrive. He ducked behind the makeshift barricade, using it as cover while he picked off the drones one by one. His augmented reflexes allowed him to track their erratic movements, but the sheer number of them was overwhelming. "They're trying to box us in," Lyrian warned. Her tone was calm but urgent. "If they pin you here, we're both dead." "Not happening," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "I've got a plan." From the corner of his eye, he spotted a fuel canister lying among the debris. It wasn't much, but it was enough to create a diversion. He fired a quick shot at the canister, triggering an explosion that sent 2 of the drones flying. The remaining drone hesitated, momentarily disoriented by the blast, giving Ethan the opening he needed to take it down. As the smoke cleared, Ethan scanned the room for any additional threats. The heat signatures on his visor had vanished, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The Vrelka were relentless. If these drones had found them, more would follow. "You're resourceful," Lyrian said, her voice tinged with admiration. "Comes with the job," Ethan replied, moving back to her side. "How are you holding up?" "I've been worse," she said, though the faint tremor in her voice betrayed her pain. "But I won't slow you down. If you need to move, leave me." "Not an option," Ethan said firmly. He knelt beside her, pulling out his medkit. "Let's get you patched up." Lyrian watched him silently as he worked, her expression unreadable. Despite the tension in the room, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she was studying him, trying to understand why he was risking so much for her. When he glanced up and met her gaze, she spoke. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You could have left me behind, like any sensible soldier would." Ethan paused, considering her question. Finally, he shrugged. "I guess I'm just not built that way. If there's even a chance I can save someone, I have to take it. That's what makes us human." Her silver eyes searched his face, as if seeking some deeper truth in his words. "You're a strange one, Ethan Cross," she said at last. "But I think I'm beginning to understand." Before he could respond, his visor flickered with a new warning: movement, fast and erratic, closing in from multiple directions. His heart sank. This wasn't just another drone patrol. It was a full squad. "They're here," Lyrian said, her voice tight. "And they're not going to stop." Ethan stood, his rifle at the ready. His mind raced, calculating their odds. The maintenance bay was too exposed, and their makeshift defenses wouldn't hold against a full assault. If they stayed, they were as good as dead. "We need to move," he said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Without waiting for a response, he scooped Lyrian into his arms. "What are you doing?" she demanded, though she didn't resist. "Improvising," Ethan said. "Hang on." With Lyrian cradled against his chest, Ethan bolted from the maintenance bay, moving as quickly and quietly as his augmented legs would allow. The sounds of the Vrelka closing in spurred him on, adrenaline surging through his veins. As he navigated the labyrinth of wreckage, Lyrian's voice reached his ears, steady despite their precarious situation. "There's a safe zone," she said. "A Darien outpost half a kilometer from here. If we can reach it." "We'll reach it," Ethan cut her off. "No, if." Lyrian's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Stubborn human." "Get used to it," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "We're getting out of this. Both of us." The sounds of pursuit grew louder, but Ethan didn't falter. His determination burned brighter than the enemy's relentless advance. Together, they pushed forward, toward the faint hope of survival. The run for survival. The ruins of the battlefield stretched out like a labyrinth, every corner a potential ambush point. Ethan moved swiftly, his augmented legs propelling him forward with precision and power, yet his every movement was calculated to avoid unnecessary noise. Lyrian rested in his arms, her weight barely noticeable thanks to his combat suit's enhancements. Despite her injuries, her sharp gaze scanned their surroundings, her warrior instincts never dulled. "Left," she whispered suddenly, her voice urgent but calm. Ethan pivoted without question, trusting her instincts. A split second later, the sharp whine of Vrelka energy weapons sizzled through the air where they had been moments before. "Good call," Ethan muttered, his grip tightening on her. "I'll take that as a sign we're heading in the right direction." Lyrian smirked faintly, though her face was pale with strain. "You humans, always so stubborn." "And you Darians," Ethan shot back, his tone light despite the tension in the air, "always so dramatic." A sudden roar in the distance cut their banter short. The sound was unmistakable, heavy Vrelka war mechs. The ground trembled faintly beneath their feet as the massive machines drew closer. Ethan's visor flashed with warnings, highlighting the incoming threats. "They've deployed heavies," Lyrian said grimly. "They're not just hunting, they're here to finish the job." Ethan's mind raced as he considered their options. The Darien outpost Lyrian had mentioned was their only chance, but the presence of war mechs complicated things. His plasma rifle wouldn't stand a chance against their thick armor, and the open terrain ahead left them dangerously exposed. "Do those war mechs have a weakness?" Ethan asked, his tone clipped. "They're power cores," Lyrian replied without hesitation. "But they're heavily shielded. You'd need to get close, too close." "Close is my specialty," Ethan said with a grin, though he felt the weight of the risk pressing down on him. He glanced at Lyrian. "How far to that outpost?" 200 meters, she said. "But the mechs will intercept us before we make it." Ethan's jaw tightened as he weighed their odds. He wasn't about to let her die here, not after everything they'd been through. "Then we'll have to split their attention," he said. "I'll draw the mechs off. You'll guide me to the outpost." Lyrian's eyes widened in alarm. "You can't." "Don't argue," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "I didn't carry you this far just to let those things stomp us into the ground. Trust me." She hesitated, her silver eyes searching his face for a moment before she nodded reluctantly. "If you die, I'll kill you." Ethan chuckled despite the gravity of the situation. "Noted. Now hold tight." He set her down carefully behind a cluster of collapsed metal beams that provided decent cover. Handing her his secondary sidearm, a compact plasma pistol, he met her gaze. "If anything comes too close, use this. Aim for weak points, joints, sensors. You know the drill. Don't get yourself killed," she said, her voice softer now, a trace of worry creeping into her tone. "Not planning on it," Ethan replied, his grin returning. "I'll be back before you know it." With that, he turned and sprinted toward the approaching mechs, his combat suit amplifying his speed. As he ran, his mind sharpened, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. The mechs were visible now, towering machines of death and destruction. Their insectoid design mirrored the Vrelka drones, but their sheer size and firepower made them infinitely more terrifying. Ethan slid behind a pile of rubble as the first mech opened fire, its energy cannons blasting the ground where he had been. The shockwave rattled his teeth, but he gritted them and kept moving, darting from cover to cover. His visor mapped the battlefield in real time, highlighting potential escape routes and weak points on the mechs. "Come on, you ugly bastards," he muttered, firing a few shots to draw their attention. The plasma bolts harmlessly deflected off the mech's shields, but it was enough to focus their wrath on him. The mechs lumbered forward, their massive legs crushing everything in their path. Ethan's heart pounded as he calculated his next move. He needed to get close enough to plant an explosive charge on one of the power cores. But the mechs weren't making it easy, their weapons firing relentlessly and forcing him to stay on the defensive. "Ethan," Lyrian's voice crackled through his comms. "The outpost is directly ahead. I've activated its beacon, it should guide you in." "Appreciate it," Ethan replied, his tone clipped. "But first, I need to even the odds." He spotted a downed Darien transport nearby, its hull partially intact. Sprinting toward it, he ducked inside just as another energy blast tore through the ground behind him. The transport's interior was a mess of shattered controls and scorched walls, but a glint of metal caught his eye. A cache of explosives, untouched and intact. "Perfect," he muttered, grabbing one of the charges. It was a Darien design, compact but powerful enough to breach a mech's shields if placed correctly. Now all he had to do was deliver it. The mechs were closing in, their massive forms blocking out the faint sunlight that filtered through the smoke-filled sky. Ethan steeled himself, his grip tightening on the explosive. Timing was everything. As the nearest mech lowered its cannon to fire, Ethan sprinted out from cover, moving faster than the machine could track. He slid beneath its massive frame, the explosive in hand, and planted the charge on its exposed power core. The mech systems whirred in confusion, but it was too late. Ethan rolled clear just as the charge detonated. The explosion was deafening, and the mech staggered, its legs collapsing as its power core erupted in a blaze of fire and electricity. Ethan didn't stop to celebrate. The remaining mech had already turned its attention to him, its weapons charging for a devastating shot. "Lyrian," Ethan called into his comms. "I hope that outpost has some kind of defense system, because I'm bringing company." "Understood," she replied, her voice steadier now. "Keep moving, I'll handle it." Ethan pushed himself to his limits, weaving through the rubble as the second mech pursued him. His lungs burned, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. The outpost's beacon was visible now, a faint blue light cutting through the haze. Salvation was within reach. As he neared the outpost, the mech raised its cannon for a final shot. Ethan's heart sank, he wouldn't make it in time. But before the mech could fire, a blinding beam of light shot out from the outpost, striking the machine square in its chest. The mech shuddered and collapsed, its systems shutting down in a cascade of sparks. Ethan stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving as he stared at the fallen machine. "Nice shot," he muttered into his comms. "You're welcome," Lyrian replied, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. Ethan entered the outpost moments later, collapsing against the nearest wall. Lyrian was waiting for him, her plasma pistol still in hand. Despite her injuries, she managed a wry smile. "Told you I'd make it," Ethan said between gasps. Lyrian shook her head, her expression softening. "You're insane." "Maybe," Ethan admitted, his grin returning. "But we're alive. That's what matters." As the outpost's automated defenses secured the perimeter, Ethan and Lyrian exchanged a look, one of mutual respect, understanding, and something deeper. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, they had a fighting chance at the hidden truths. The outpost's walls hummed with the soft thrum of alien technology. The air inside was cool and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos and heat of the battlefield outside. Ethan leaned against the smooth metal wall, his breathing finally slowing. Across the room, Lyrian sat on a low bench, her face pale but composed, her injuries temporarily stabilized by the outpost's automated medical systems. "Nice place you've got here," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "For a secret base, it's cozy." Lyrian managed a faint smile. "It's an emergency outpost, not a resort. But it's functional, and for now, it's safe." Ethan nodded, scanning the room. The outpost's design was unmistakably Darien, sleek, minimalist, and imbued with a faint, glowing blue light that seemed to pulse gently in rhythm with the machinery. Monitors along the walls displayed readouts in the Darien language, their symbols indecipherable to him but clearly familiar to Lyrian. "How long do you think we've got before the Vrelka try again?" Ethan asked. Lyrian's expression darkened. "Not long. They don't give up easily, and they know we're here now. This outpost has defenses, but it wasn't designed to withstand a prolonged assault." Ethan frowned, his mind already racing with possibilities. What kind of defenses are we talking about? Automated plasma turrets, an energy shield with limited charge, and a few proximity mines, Lyrian listed. Enough to hold off a small force, but not an army. Great, Ethan muttered. So we're sitting ducks. Lyrian tilted her head, studying him. You humans have a peculiar way of always assuming the worst. Experience, Ethan said dryly. We tend to plan for things going south because they usually do. Lyrian's faint smile returned. And yet, you always find a way to survive. Ethan shrugged. It's what we do. Silence settled between them for a moment, broken only by the soft hum of the outpost systems. Ethan glanced at Lyrian, noting the way her silver eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Despite her injuries, there was a strength in her gaze. A determination that mirrored his own. So, he said, leaning back against the wall. What's your story, Lyrian? How does a Darien warrior captain end up half-buried in a war zone? Her expression grew distant, her gaze flickering to one of the monitors. We were on a reconnaissance mission, she said quietly. The Vrelka ambushed us, hit us harder and faster than we anticipated. My squad, they didn't make it. Ethan's chest tightened at the pain in her voice. I'm sorry. Lyrian shook her head, her jaw tightening. I should have seen it coming. I should have been able to protect them. You can't blame yourself, Ethan said firmly. War doesn't play fair. It's brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. We do the best we can, but sometimes it's not enough. Her eyes met his, a flicker of gratitude in her gaze. You speak as though you've known that pain. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. I lost my unit in the same ambush. The 42nd Recon Division, wiped out to the last man. I'm all that's left. Lyrian's expression softened. I'm sorry. Yeah, Ethan said quietly. Me too. Another silence fell, this one heavier with the weight of shared loss. Ethan felt a strange sense of connection with Lyrian, an understanding that went beyond words. They were both survivors, bound by the same scars. What about you? Lyrian asked suddenly. Why did you choose to save me? You could have left me there and saved yourself. Ethan leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe it's because I couldn't save my squad. Maybe it's because I've seen too much death, and I'm tired of adding to the pile. Or maybe it's just because I looked at you and thought, I can't leave her here. Lyrian studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she said softly, You're an unusual human, Ethan Cross. I'll take that as a compliment, he said with a faint grin. Before she could respond, the outpost systems chimed, drawing their attention to the monitors. Lyrian's gaze sharpened as she studied the readouts, her expression darkening. What is it? Ethan asked, moving to her side. Vrelka reinforcements, she said grimly. They're mobilizing, an entire strike force. Ethan's stomach sank. How long do we have? An hour, maybe less, Lyrian replied. They'll overwhelm the outpost's defenses easily. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Then we need to find another option. Is there anything here we can use, anything that gives us an edge? Lyrian hesitated, her gaze flickering to one of the larger monitors. There might be. Ethan followed her gaze, frowning at the schematic displayed on the screen. What is that? A prototype weapon, Lyrian said. It's experimental, a joint project between the Darians and humans. It was designed to neutralize Vrelka technology by disrupting their energy frequencies. But it's unstable. The last test didn't go well. Define didn't go well, Ethan said cautiously. Lyrian's lips pressed into a thin line. The weapon overloaded and destroyed everything within a half-kilometer radius. Including the operators. Ethan winced. Right. So it's a last resort. Exactly, Lyrian said. But if we can't hold the outpost, it might be our only chance. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze hardening. Then we'd better make it work. The two of them moved quickly, working together to activate the prototype weapon. The outpost systems were ancient, and the controls were finicky, but Lyrian's familiarity with Darien technology made the process smoother. As they worked, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the strange partnership they had formed, a human soldier and a Darien warrior, fighting side by side against impossible odds. I hope this thing doesn't blow us to pieces, Ethan muttered as he adjusted one of the weapon's power conduits. Lyrian glanced at him, a faint smirk on her lips. You humans thrive on optimism, don't you? Always, Ethan replied with a grin. Keeps life interesting. Despite the tension, Lyrian chuckled softly. If we survive this, Ethan Cross, I might just have to revise my opinion of humans. I'll hold you to that, Ethan said, his grin widening. The weapon hummed to life, its energy building steadily as the outpost systems redirected power to its core. The monitors displayed a countdown, 30 minutes until the Vrelka strike force arrived. Ethan stepped back, his gaze fixed on the glowing weapon. Here's hoping this thing does what it's supposed to. Lyrian stood beside him, her expression resolute. If it doesn't, we'll make sure the Vrelka remember our names. Ethan glanced at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. You're one hell of a warrior, Lyrian. And you're one hell of a human, she replied. As the countdown ticked closer to 0, the two of them prepared for what could very well be their final stand. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would do it as equals. The final stand. The soft hum of the prototype weapon filled the outpost, a reminder of the fragile hope it represented. Outside, the Vrelka strike force approached steadily, their presence marked by faint tremors in the ground. Ethan and Lyrian stood side by side, watching the countdown on the monitor tick down. 15 minutes. The air was heavy with tension, but neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say, only preparations to make. Ethan checked his plasma rifle one last time, his hand steady despite the storm brewing within him. Lyrian adjusted the settings on her energy blade, its edge glowing faintly as it activated. How many are we looking at? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Too many, Lyrian replied. Her silver eyes remained fixed on the monitor, her expression unreadable. A dozen war mechs, several drone squads, and infantry. They're throwing everything they have at us. Ethan let out a low whistle. They really don't like us, huh? You've made quite the impression, Lyrian said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Humans do have a talent for irritating the Vrelka. Glad to know I'm living up to expectations, Ethan said with a dry chuckle. So, what's the plan? Lyrian's gaze shifted to him, her expression hardening. We hold them off as long as we can. The prototype weapon requires precise activation. If the timing is off, it could either fail entirely or, well, destroy us along with the Vrelka. Sounds fun, Ethan said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Guess we'll just have to nail the timing. Lyrian nodded, her smirk fading. There's one more thing. The weapon's energy pulse will disable all technology within its range, including your suit's augmentations. Ethan frowned, his mind racing. His suit was the only thing keeping him on par with the Vrelka's superior numbers. Without it, he'd be vulnerable. Good to know, he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. I'll make it work. You always do, Lyrian said softly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before she turned back to the monitors. 10 minutes. Ethan moved to the entrance of the outpost, peering through the narrow slit in the wall that served as a makeshift observation point. The Vrelka were visible now, their dark forms moving with eerie precision across the battlefield. The war mechs loomed in the distance, their massive frames cutting imposing silhouettes against the smoke-filled horizon. "They're splitting into 3 groups," Ethan noted, his visor analyzing their formation. "One squad to draw our fire, another to flank us, and the mechs to break through the defenses. They'll target the weapon first," Lyrian said, joining him at the observation point. "It's their greatest threat." Ethan nodded. "Then we'll have to keep them distracted." 5 minutes. The countdown ticked closer to 0, each second stretching out like an eternity. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he refused to let it show. He glanced at Lyrian, her expression a mask of calm determination. For a moment, he wondered how she managed to stay so composed in the face of near-certain death. "You ready for this?" he asked. "Always," she replied without hesitation. "Good," Ethan said, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Let's give them hell." The first wave hit hard. The Vrelka drones swarmed the outpost, their energy weapons lighting up the darkened sky. The automated turrets sprang to life, their plasma bolts tearing through the drones with ruthless efficiency. Ethan and Lyrian joined the fray, their weapons adding to the symphony of destruction. Ethan's rifle barked with precision, each shot finding its mark as he moved with practiced ease. Beside him, Lyrian was a blur of motion, her energy blade carving through the drones with deadly grace. Despite her injuries, she fought with a ferocity that left Ethan in awe. "They're testing our defenses," Lyrian said, her voice steady even as she dispatched another drone. "The main force will hit soon." "Let them come," Ethan replied, reloading his rifle. "We'll hold." The second wave arrived moments later, a mix of drones and infantry that swarmed the outpost like a tide of darkness. The energy shield flickered as it absorbed their attacks, its charge depleting rapidly. Ethan gritted his teeth, firing relentlessly as the enemy closed in. "Ethan," Lyrian called out, her voice sharp with urgency. "The war mechs are moving." Ethan turned his attention to the distant figures, his stomach sinking. The war mechs advanced steadily, their energy cannons charging with ominous blue light. The outpost's defenses wouldn't last long against their firepower. "Keep them off me," Ethan said, his tone firm. "I'm going for the mechs." Lyrian's eyes widened. "You can't." "I can," he interrupted. "Trust me." She hesitated, then nodded. "Don't die." "No promises," Ethan said with a grin, then sprinted toward the outpost's perimeter. The ground shook beneath him as the war mechs opened fire, their energy blasts carving deep craters into the earth. Ethan moved with purpose, weaving through the chaos as he closed the distance between him and the nearest mech. His visor highlighted its weak points, but he knew this wouldn't be easy. He darted behind a pile of rubble, narrowly avoiding a blast that sent shards of metal flying. His heart pounded as he activated the explosive charge in his hand, its faint glow a reminder of the stakes. Taking a deep breath, he broke from cover and sprinted toward the mech. The machine turned to face him, its weapons locking on. Ethan slid beneath its massive frame, planting the charge on its power core before rolling clear. The explosion rocked the battlefield, and the mech collapsed in a shower of sparks and fire. "One down," Ethan muttered, already moving toward the next target. Back at the outpost, Lyrian fought with renewed vigor, her energy blade a beacon of defiance against the swarm. She watched Ethan's progress through the monitors, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and admiration. The countdown hit 30 seconds. "Ethan," Lyrian called over the comms, her voice tight. "The weapon's ready. Get back here." "On my way," Ethan replied, his voice strained. He dispatched one last drone before sprinting toward the outpost, his legs burning with effort. The war mechs turned their attention to him, their cannons firing in unison. Ethan's world became a blur of explosions and searing heat as he zigzagged through the chaos. He could see the outpost now, its faint blue glow a beacon of hope. 10 seconds. Ethan dove through the outpost's entrance just as the countdown hit 0. The weapon activated with a deafening hum, its energy pulse ripping through the battlefield. The Vrelka forces froze as their technology shut down, their war mechs collapsing like marionettes with severed strings. Silence fell. Ethan lay on the floor, his chest heaving as he stared up at the ceiling. Lyrian knelt beside him, her silver eyes shining with relief. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," Ethan corrected, a faint smile on his lips. Outside, the battlefield was eerily still, the Vrelka forces utterly neutralized. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace.